Um, and well, you know what? Yeah, clearly the world has run out of ideas, and all they've got left is warfare, which is what happens when everything breaks down. Hopefully, it won't. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it is already underway, isn't it? But I don't know. Other
Oh,
than that, it's fine.
it's a nail in already struggling system.
Yeah. Look, we know that things have got to fall apart and then for something new to emerge beyond it. And, we might get swept away in the process. There's no guarantees. Just because we're tuned into it doesn't protect us, doesn't give us immunity. But, we can only do what we can do.
Yeah. Uh, Steve, let me just go. Let me just pick up this call.
Sure, 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 sure. Okay, welcome everyone. Have a couple of minutes before we start, just settling in. We are streaming on YouTube as well. Links on my Facebook page and on the Academy website page. I have tweeted the link as well. The theme for this week and next week is obtain a yield. We're reminded we can't work on an empty stomach. And following on from catch and store energy, which was what was the underlying theme for last week. Our permaculture strategy follows a flow, follows a plan. It's like a continuous evaluation, perhaps. We're observing and interacting. We're asking questions. We're looking. We're inquiring, asking: are things working? In what ways things maybe are difficult or challenging, or not doing what they're supposed to do? Having an awareness of perhaps what information or support we might need to move the system forward. We're observing and interacting. Our primary goal, as we're observing and interacting, is to catch and store energy. We want to slow things down. We want to arrange things in ways in which we can build a resource base from which we can obtain yields. We can begin to nourish ourselves, nourish our family, our people around us, but also nourish the system that's feeding us. We're reminded, we're encouraged to think in terms of obtaining a yield. The yield is to nourish every part of the system, not just ourselves, so that the system itself can go forward. So we're meeting needs and returning surplus. Okay. I'm going to jump into my slideshow. I'm going to think about different yields, the nature of yields. By yield, I'm talking about the outputs of the system. So if we're going to put something in place, how are we going to maintain it? How are we going to keep it going? Okay, so the first image is it's a piece of rainforest. And as I understand it, this picture, it's a library picture. This is a piece of forest that has been purchased by a rich billionaire, I don't know, Swedish guy or something like that, businessman. And he's purchased it, I'm not sure who from or how that works, with the intention of it remaining pristine, within the intention of it just being left as a purely natural, without human interaction, I guess, or very carefully managed human interactions within it. So here's the thought. Here's a line of thinking: so what are the yields? What are the outputs of this system? Why would someone want to spend their money to own a piece of land that they don't go to and they don't want anyone else to go to? Put it that way. So really my first question, and the most line of questioning is, let's think about the ecological functioning that's going on within this landscape. This is a landscape which is holding an enormous amount of water. Look at that, it's a continuous tree canopy, trees living and dying, photosynthesizing and building a carbon-rich soil, building organic matter, or in a tropical system, rather than building up a deep soil, the development of the canopy and of the forest and of the living biota the within the system, the living biomass of the system. Holds carbon, holds water. So that's part of the long-term homeostatic function, homeostasis, to keep something the same, maintaining humidity in the atmosphere. And obviously, at the end of the day, the rainforest is part of long-term climate systems on the planet. It's how the planet self-regulates, or how our weather systems, how the evapotranspiration from plants affects localized but also global climate systems. We know that biodiversity is very important, and maintaining that biodiversity, that's part, obviously, of the functioning of a natural system. So it's a place where we could visit, we could pass through, perhaps to learn from. Think about the yield of studying a natural system that's been allowed to be protected and allowed to develop in this way. So understand that yields might take many forms, and there might be many different beneficiaries. Team building. So developing yields takes some planning and organizing. And any plan that you set in motion can always evolve and develop. So this first slide is saying often a good place to start is with team building. And through understanding, articulating, and learning permaculture principles, that in itself can be part of the team building process. So the slide is from a permaculture course from a few years ago up in West Nile, in the refugee settlement areas there. And we found ourselves working with a group of 40 people with different languages and different cultural backgrounds. And to be able to begin our permaculture journey, our learning journey together, what felt really important was to start off by building a team, of making people understand that they're part of a collective endeavor. And by setting and identifying short-term, medium-term, and longer-term goals that we might achieve by working together, we can then feel that we are coming together as a team. And it's always good to have a sense of some good activities to do when you're bringing a group of people together, that maybe help remember names, understand people's different skills that they might have, or different experiences. We can set in place, if we're working with a group of people, think about how we prepare food, how we wash, how we manage our waste, or whether we're running composting toilets. Let's think of the ways in which we could set systems in place that's going to help us come together as a team, and to remember to keep investing in that team building process, so that we have the ability to face longer term and more complex challenges, and think of the value of that feeling. Now, we went working with displaced people, with refugees, and perhaps people who had social connections have been broken, have been obviously displaced, dislocated. As permaculture designers, what strategies can we put in place to allow people to come together and begin to know each other again? And can, through permaculture sort of language, its learning process, can that itself be a tool that brings us together? So think about team building, that we're preparing to take on long-term, more complex tasks. And if we can understand through Earth Care, People Care, Fair Share, we're all trying to do the same thing. And it's in our advantage to collaborate, find ways to work together. This I've put this in as an unexpected yield. It's a picture of a community building, a church in the in Bidi Bidi refugee settlement. I think we were supposed to be working with 8 or 9 people, and we were coming into doing small group work. And on that particular day, about 200 people turned up because I guess there wasn't much else going on, but there was a genuine curiosity in what was going on. And that then gave us a chance to think, how we could utilize that yield. How could we harvest the energy of those 200 people that turned up that day, wondering what was going on? We quickly adjusted the workshop that we were doing and thought of a way to harness and use the energy of the people around. And I think that's a key lesson in permaculture. It's a catch and store energy and then channel it into something useful. And we built a community garden. We turned compost heaps. We moved a lot of materials around. Certain kinds of jobs that lend themselves to having a lot of people power. And on that particular occasion, we were able to rise to that and to take advantage of that. So building strategies to develop yields and then thinking about how we make the most of those yields and understand that any system is going to have multiple outputs, some of which we didn't anticipate and some of it weren't intent, some of which might not have been intentioned, but all of which have something to offer. It took me a while to, this slide is about short-term yields. And it's a beginning of trying to get us to think about sequencing and timing and to think, there's some things that we get a return quite quickly back on, like sprouting seeds. These are beans, peas, and lentils, and they've been allowed to sprout. So to make them, actually, it took me a while to understand this. And let me just unpack this a little bit moment. So if you take a bean or a pea, a lentil, that we kind of food we're seeing here, and we eat it in its raw state, in its seed state, it's actually very hard to digest. And seeds themselves aren't very digestible. We normally have to grind them up, cook them, ferment them, cook them a long time to make them digestible. If instead you sprout a seed, let's allow it to start growing, all the enzymes needed to digest and make the nutrients available that are inside the seed, the enzymes were in the seed. So as you start to digest it, it becomes many more times nutritious. A short-term yield. So this is a much quicker than growing the whole vegetable, much quicker, but obviously it's something that's a very quick return. And if we're clever, if we are strategic, we'll put in place plans to create short-term, medium-term, and long-term yields, maybe very long-term yields. So think about tree crops, think about fruiting trees, think about timber trees, think about a sequence of events. From sprouting a few seeds might give us a yield in 2 or 3 days, to here we see some people building raised beds out of locally available materials. Raised beds, here we have another set of pictures. Actually, this was a wonderful moment. I was with a couple of Sector 39 team members, and we were visiting our friends in Mbali at the Mount Elgon Coffee and Honey Cooperative. And we got into a conversation about keyhole beds, about raised beds. And I think the comment was someone wasn't familiar with that technique. So instead of sort of explaining it, we built one. And here it is. Here is that moment. And what was so wonderful is it created a yield, as in the family concerned learn how to do this technique. They planted beans in it, which then ultimately fed them. So think about the intellectual yield, the yield of coming together as a group and as a team, of learning something new, of the process of coming together as a group, and then growing beans, which I understand children got involved in doing, and maybe that was part of that output as well. Look, there it is. They even sent me that photo some weeks later of their crop coming. We could talk about keyhole beds briefly. Let's take a moment just to consider this simple strategy for obtaining a yield. You can see there's lots of different ways of doing it. These ones I'm seeing are made out of bamboo. These ones here are made out of stone. It's a lovely, really well-developed set of raised beds. I believe this is in Kenya. This is us again. So let's just take a little moment. Let's take a little time out and just ask ourselves a question: why would we build a keyhole bed? What would be the reason? And what were the right materials to build it out of? How big is it? How do we look after it? Let's unpack it a little bit, and let's begin to use very simple permaculture design thinking and tools. Okay, so we're going to observe and interact, we're going to catch and store energy, and we're going to obtain a yield. All right, there's our first 3 stepping stone principles in permaculture. Okay, so we observe and interact, and we ask ourselves the question is, what do we need to build a keyhole bed? What materials, and obviously the correct answer to that is the materials you're going to make the bed out of is whatever you have to hand. If you have stone, you're going to make it out of stone. If you have wood, you can make it from wood. If you have bamboo, you can use bamboo. And if you have, looks like maize sacks, then you can use maize sack. There's no right or wrong answer. In permaculture, we're not interested so much in what the design looks like. What we're interested in is, does it do the job intended? Does it fulfill the intended function? Okay. Let's have a little think about the functions of a raised bed and why we might go to the trouble of building one. Well, depending on the height of the wall, that might actually be able to exclude grazing animals. It might be able to form. It might allow you to interact with your bed without having to bend over so much. So there's a well-designed. We want to use elements that fulfill multiple functions. If our bed can fulfill multiple functions, then hey, that's good permaculture. That's what we're trying to do. We're going to build them out of locally available materials. And there are advantages of that, of course. You minimize the transport. Maybe you have the right skills. You're familiar with working with those materials. The people around you will be familiar for working with those materials, even if you're not. And we're clearing the ground. We're probably going to release stones and other materials. Okay, so how big is the bed? What's the shape? Why are we doing this exactly? Well, go back to our first thoughts about soil. And we talked about the A horizon of soil, that first layer of soil that's very rich in nutrients, in organic matter. There's a lot of oxygen, moisture. Now we want to accentuate that A horizon. If that's a bit deeper, and we keep it very carefully maintained, then we're going to create the absolutely perfect conditions for growing. So all we're doing is trying to create, and remember what we said in the soil lecture, healthy topsoil, the A horizon soil, is by volume, it's 50% air. We don't want to stand on it. We don't want animals standing on it. We don't want heavy rainfall falling onto it. We want to keep it uncompacted. And so we can do that we can gather the topsoil from the path, gather the better soil from around, and then add it on top of the bed. It builds it up. We can layer in organic matter. We can, if we've got dead leaves and grasses, we can throw them in the bottom, build the soil up on top, and understand how in time the soil biota, the life in your soil, will break that matter down and incorporate it into the soil. Why do we have this keyhole shape? Why is the notch cut out of it? Well, so you can reach without standing on the bed. We don't want to compact the soil. We're trying to create the ideal conditions for soil microbes and earthworms and everything else to do their business. And if they're happy, everything else is happy. Our plants are going to be happy. So look, in this one, we have in the middle, made for some sticks or some, I don't know, you can use wire or anything, materials that you have, is a compost bin, somewhere where we can introduce organic matter from the top, a continuous process, and any grey water from washing, any leftover materials like that, you've now got somewhere for them to go. They're going to be go somewhere where strategically they have the biggest impact. Now, we're going to hear from so many examples from some of our team members and from Kenya, from Deborah there in Teso, but how we can get really creative and create raised beds out of anything. We can explore different shapes and explore many different possibilities. But the key is you don't want to make the bed wider than you can reach. And on average, we can reach about 60 centimeters. So you don't want to make the bed more than 1.2 meters wide, so you can reach into the middle from all around the edges. And we're concentrating our design to create the right conditions for soil building, and for soil microbes, the soil biota. So we want to try and keep it permanently moist, and we want to introduce organic matter slowly through the compost system, and we can keep the soil covered with a bit of mulch. If we're in a hotter and drier area, we could also erect a partial shade over the bed as well to allow things to establish. Think about exploring design creatively with the materials that you have around to create a system that meets the needs of the elements within it, and then it will create a yield that comes back to you. I have so many photos from different places and examples of wonderful raised bed systems. These are just a very few of them, and I invite everyone to begin to think about your own, creative journey. Think about how you can begin to identify and collect together the materials that you have around you, that you can begin to assemble into systems that are going to catch and store energy and develop a yield. Look, here we're even making a little forest garden system in a school in Wales. And here's a beginning. Okay, I'll just pause a second. I do get carried away. As we've been moving through this PDC, I've been encouraging you to use observation and to see patterns. And I've also said to you that permaculture is like a pattern language. When we look at complex things, we can easily get lost in the detail. And what we're always trying to do, especially as we're coming through this design course process, is take us a few steps back and see the underlying patterns. So we've looked at plant shapes and root shapes and things like that just a little bit. And let's just jump into this picture here, this of a simple food forest system. And it's bringing in the idea of guilds. It's encouraging us to think how a group of plants might work together. And I've already touched on the idea that in monocultures, where we have a lot of one kind of plant, we create conditions where there's a lot of competition. So let's understand by exploring this picture to see what the kind of opposite of that might be. Where we might have, first thing we might say about this in our little system is we have plants that have different life trajectories. This tree can be going to grow and develop slowly over a longer period of time and build yields, and it might take a few years perhaps before it starts returning fruits to the system. But it's also providing shade, it's providing humidity, and the leaf litter that's falling is providing a mulch. So you think about how this tree and the presence of this tree might affect and interact in a small with other plants around it. And we've used this word microclimate before, and I like to say never underestimate how important microclimate is. It's that subtle difference between the sunny side and the shady side, the cooler side, the hotter side, the damper side, and in a polyculture system. So what's the opposite of monoculture? Mono being one, is poly, meaning many, polyculture. Permaculture, we're interested, maybe how, the question we might want to ask is, can we blend these together? Can we have diverse polyculture systems and then still have fields of particular crops that we want? This helps build, it's better for soil, it's better for the biodiversity, and it's better for reduction of pests. Anyway, let's get ahead of ourselves. Let's just explore this image. So we're thinking about the tree, look at the shape of the roots going sideways and down, and how that tree might have a long-term soil building, shading, nutrient cycling, function. What we also notice is that some of these other plants in the picture have very different shaped roots. We've got this one here with many deep, straight, branching roots going down very deeply. This one that looks more like a crown. We have surface rooting plants. We have some with a single tap root. And we have others with branching roots. It's mixing together. There's a wonderful permaculture farmer, teacher, writer, broadcaster in Austria called Sepp Holzer. We might have a chance to look at some of his work. Really inspirational. In one of his talks, he says there's basically 3 root patterns. There's the surface roots that knit together the surface of the soil. There's the really deep tap-rooted plants, and there's the kind of middle ones. So you've got surface, middle, deep. Simplistically, seeing the patterns. So in a polyculture, you want to mix together the 3 root depths. And the more you achieve that, then, as we can see, we then have soil interactions from the surface deep down into the soil. That's bringing carbon, it's bringing water, it's bringing oxygen much deeper down, and it creates the opportunity then for much more effective and much more whole nutrient cycling. So we're mixing together surface rooted plants with deep rooted plants. We're mixing together herbaceous plants with trees and shrubs. We've got ground cover plants, and we've also got big, tall, standing plants. Creates a different set of conditions. This tree is a pear, maybe this is a fruiting tree, maybe this is part of our the yield for us. Some of these surface plants here might be being grown as green manures, plants that are grown to feed the soil. But we've got lots of herbs and other kinds of fruits and other kinds of perennial vegetables. Now, I'm showing you the pattern because the detail is going to be different where you are. As we're going on this permaculture journey, I'm kind of, as I've said before, I'm trying to kind of tracking David Holmgren's 12 principles to make sure that we're kind of following the sequence that he's given us to understand. And I'm also checking in on Bill Mollison's book because that really is the foundation that permaculture is built on. And chapter 5, week 5, chapter 5 of permaculture in the Permaculture Designer's Manual is all about different climate zones. And it's about understanding the difference between the humid tropics, the dry tropics, the humid temperate and cold climates. That, again, it's a pattern. Certain different conditions and opportunities exist, and different challenges exist, and different kind of limiting factors. There's no ideal climate system. There's just this relative advantages and disadvantages of different ones, I guess. So what I'm saying is, this is a temperate food forest system. I recognize all of the plants and all the names in this, but I'm giving it to you as a pattern because you're going to think about what would be the things that would fit into that pattern that you want to grow, that grow in your soil or in your climate or the plants that you're familiar with. So again, remember, you're the designer, but you're letting nature inform you how you go about the designing process. It's for you to consider, as the designer, what yields you want to come out of the system. What's your favorite fruit? What does well in your climate, or what do you know is useful to you where you are? And only you know that answer. You know the answer to that question better than anyone else. So that's our beginning to think about how we approach obtaining yields. So I guess these systems, these keyhole beds that we've just been looking at, these are designed for vegetables, but they're herbaceous plants. They live a cycle and they die. They're either biannuals or annuals. So that's the first part of the succession. Remember, these are the plants that grow in bare soil. So actually, it's really good to grow these kind of plants in raised beds because we can control the environment. Bare soil's very vulnerable. Small baby plant, they get eaten, they get stood on, they dry out, they get flooded. We can create optimum conditions for establishing these higher value, faster growing elements of our system, and to think about how we cultivate a yield in that way. When we start thinking about forest garden systems, then that's longer term. They take longer to establish, but they also yield and feed back over a longer period of time. So short-term, medium-term, and long-term yields. Think about how we can incorporate all of those into our systems and how then that gives us a range of opportunities. We're not just reliant on a crop of maize or a crop of mangoes or something like that. We've got it's stacked in time and it's stacked in diversity, and we've also put something in which is, of course, the most important yield is it's also building soil. If we're doing it right, we're building soil. There's no keeping things the same. It's either breaking down or it's accumulating. And if we're doing it right, it's accumulating. And that opens up a world of possibilities every time. Here's Rose Nabigwere in Rwanda. She's down there in Huye in the Southern District. And in Gisagara. Here she is it's actually a tiny little garden, but you can still get lost in it. A little food forest by her house, or what was her house, there in Rwanda. Um, she's leaning on a guava tree, and I know that there were avocados in there. There was definitely bananas, taro and maize, coffee, um, all different kinds of herbs layered together and positioned by a house, by her home, in a way in which it gave a bit of shade, it gave a bit of privacy. It had multiple functions and gave multiple yields. It might have taken a little bit of time to establish it, but now that it's established, it gives back almost continuously. So permaculture, we're really interested in having different kinds of yields coming on different time frames and have a different kind of resilience. So here's a thought is, we've had outbreaks of locusts in Kenya in recent years. Think how an annual crop like maize can be decimated by visitation from locusts, whereas long-term perennial crops, trees, can recover, can regrow, and they can exist on a longer time frame. So a diversity of yields adds resilience to the system. And also, by having a diversity of yields, we're learning. We're always pushing ourselves to, let's play with another plant, let's play with another output, let's explore, see if we can stack another element into the system and see how that contributes. Thinking about these kind of patterns, about how plants, different types of plant, different shapes of plant might fit together, tessellate together, to use the word, in a productive, mutually beneficial pattern. Here's that's in Rwanda. This is in the UK. These are two pictures from the Risk Roof Garden in Reading. I'll try and dig some pictures out of that for you for that one. This is on a roof. This is actually in a town centre in Reading in the UK. And a place where I worked many years ago as a teacher, teaching about environment and permaculture. And this rooftop forest garden is in 30 centimeters of soil only, and originally was designed, it had about 170 species of plants, and we chose ones which had multiple uses. They were edible, medicinal, fibers, beneficial for insects. But and the other criteria was we chose plants from all around the world, and we wanted to explore the heritage of plants that has come to us from our ancestors, from places far and wide. That not forgetting that our ancestors tamed wild plants and created the varieties that we now enjoy. That biodiversity is part of the yield, and we are custodians of that. The most valuable thing we pass on to the next generation is the seeds, the biodiversity of seeds, and that's something, and the knowledge of how perhaps to use them and how to work with those plants. So it's been a tremendous journey to be able to explore these same ideas in different contexts. So the patterns are the same, the details are different. We think about how climatic factors, the resource availability factors, these are all going to shape your design, and they're going to shape the kind of yields that you can create within it. But there's no upper limit to what you can produce. This is the challenge that Bill Mollison gives us. He said there's no upper limit to productivity. The only limit is your imagination and your ability to cycle resources ever more efficient. Look, once we've established our food forest, we can bring in the bees and the honey, or we could Maybe start to get mushrooms or understand. We can run climbers up the trees. We can always expand the surface area more efficiently, catch and store energy. How far can we go? There's the challenge. We should realize there's potentially no upper limit. Here's catching and storing energy, using available resources, building systems that will harvest, catch and store, and build yields over time. Think about multiple functions. Let's think about strategic placement of elements, because these aspects of design, it's not just that we're going to grow some trees or we're going to have a food forest, but where are we going to put it? What's the combination of elements within it? What's the sequence of its development? There's a lot of things that we can think about. So, and here we are, we're only on day 5 of our 24-week course, so we're still early days. So here's thinking about that. Elements can perform multiple functions. That's one of the rules. And here we have some elements which are trees. These trees might be serving. This tree on the outside might be fodder for browsing animals. We might be cutting branches off that to feed cows. This tree might be producing fruits, and this one might be producing nuts. And these ones we might be growing ultimately for timber. But together, and the way that they've been planted, they also function as a windbreak. They also slow down the flow of air across the landscape. And in fact, what's interesting, just to unpack this a little bit, is so what happens in a windbreak is the air still flows through the trees, but the trees, as they move and sway, take some of the energy out of the airflow, out of the wind, slowing it down. So the air that's coming behind it is pushed up and over the top. And that can have in this picture, it has up to 200-foot impact. A 35 feet high windbreak seems to be pushing the wind velocity, reducing it significantly, even 200 meters the other side of the windbreak. So think about how air flows over the land. Think about how that air interacts with the trees, and how the slowing of the air through the trees lifts the air off behind it, which significantly reduces the buffeting effect of the wind. This might help protect your crops. This might help protect your compound or your homestead. Think about the different functions that could be served by a windbreak. Strategic placement of elements in a system that creates multiple yields that contributes to the whole system in the short term, the medium, and the long term. Hey, that's permaculture. That's how we're trying to think. These are the pieces of our jigsaw I'm trying to give to you. Here's a lovely picture of from Felix Akicho. Is that right? Am I saying that right? I hope. I forget. I chatted with Felix through Facebook a year or two ago, and he sent me this picture of a swale. To me, it looks like he lives somewhere that looks very tropical, and it looks like they have very heavy downfalls of rain. That intense downfall of rain needs to have somewhere to go, and he's excavated what looks like a very deep sort of swale. Rainwater harvesting a reception, and look how he has reinforced it and stabilized it with a deep-rooted plant. In this case, he's using lemongrass, and I'm interested there to see the multiple yields of he's harvesting rainwater, he's reducing evaporation, he's increasing infiltration. Oh, and he's stopping the erosion. And he's got a nice yield of lemongrass. He can make essential oils out of that. He can use it as a culinary ingredient. You can weave with it. You can do so much with it. So we want elements that perform multiple functions. We thought about what a windbreak function might look like. Here's a water catchment function with reinforcement from lemongrass. So now let's just go a little bit further and think about how our swale systems might multifunction. How our contour excavation intercepts rainwater and slows it down and encourages it to saturate the ground, to percolate down, recharge groundwater. But we could choose the plants that we grow on the swale. They're going to enjoy that extra bit of moisture, aren't they? We could put plants perhaps that add shade, plants perhaps that fix nitrogen, plants that are part of our yield for ourselves. That swale might become a pathway. We could introduce elements in there that might feed cattle or goats, or let's think about the function. Can we have multiple functions? It's not just a water catchment feature. If it's on contour, it's also going to become a pathway of some kind. And it could be a shaded pathway with productive plants within it. We're thinking about how we can strategically make the smallest intervention that has the maximum impact. So look, my planting along my swale acts as a windbreak. It creates more shelter. It's then allowing the infiltration of water and stabilization of soils. And then, let's have a bunch of different yields from that too. Let's think about how, especially, let's try and grow in that system what we need to maintain that system. Let's think of it that way. Is it a boundary of a field? Is it a pathway? For sure, it's going to catch and store water, but it's going to do other things too. So we can see how a swale catching and storing energy in this form is, look how the water's sitting in it. It's not flowing sideways, it's sitting in it because we want it to soak into the ground slowly, slowly, slowly. The swale's as big as it needs to be. So if you have a heavy rainfall and your swale is full and overflowing, you need to make it bigger. You need to make it higher or deeper or wider. It needs to hold that rainfall and give it time to soak into the ground. And once we've got that in place, we can then think about building a guild of species around it. Look how we've got timber trees either side. We've got bamboo, which creates a living fence, which creates a shade. We've got fruit trees in here. We've got nitrogen fixing trees here. So we've got the pioneer plants that build the soil, and then we've got the plants that will provide the yield to us, growing in, protected from the shade of the one tree and fertilized by the other. And then think about how that rainfall, once it begins to percolate into the ground, slowly through gravity, will sort of create a plume underground. That water can only go one way, it can go downhill. So it's going to percolate into the soil until it becomes impermeable, then it's going to find its way downhill and nourish all the other plants below it. So and then think about how that same system could repeat across a landscape as we move down through a landscape, and we can explore creating different microhabitats, different climatic conditions, microclimates, and then think about how we can stack in yields into that system. Here we seem to have lots of ducks, we've got children playing, we've got a diversity of different plants, and think about the stepping stones that you might make if you're coming into a landscape that is degraded and doesn't have any shade. if we were coming in, our first intervention might be to build the swale, but look how they've at least tried to cover all the soil with mulch, with dead grasses and so forth. And what we would plant, the first things that we would plant into that swale would be the things that are going to build soil, the nitrogen fixing, faster growing plants. That's where you use your leukina and your other leguminous shrubs and trees. We could cover that bank with beans and just allow them to grow quickly and as a green manure yield or as a quick yield back to us. Think about the succession of moving. So we might have that in mind as our design. There's our plan. Step one is to get the swale in place, and then step two is to grow the understory, is to pepper these with seeds of the faster growing nitrogen fixing peas and beans, the fast growing shrubby trees, allow them to grow. We can always chop and drop, use them as mulches themselves, and then they're the support species that then will allow your fruit trees and your timber trees, your long-term yields to develop. So we can think about how we might be able to get an annual crop in the first phase of development, and then as the system develops, we're going to develop longer and longer term diverse yields. And then let's also think about the ecosystem services that our swale system would now be operating. It's starting to rehumidify the whole landscape. It's starting to create wildlife corridors. It's trying to create a seed bomb, if you like, that can then be used to propagate to benefit surrounding our farms and communities. Think about going back to team building, common visioning, how if we can see these potentials together across communities, across boundaries, to see we can build longer term plans, and we can regenerate whole wide landscapes. The techniques that we're discussing, so far, they're not out of reach. They're not really complicated. They don't involve significant investment. They take teamwork. They take vision. They take people coming together, working as teams, and they need to be consistent over time. Team building is us visiting a couple of years ago in Kampala at a permaculture training center, the name of which I've slightly forgotten, but anyway. I think working with people, human connections, improve skill, knowledge, and experience as an important part of the yield of your farm system. The more you learn through observation and interaction, the more knowledge you will have to share with your peers, your family, and your community. So think about catching and storing energy, as in your learning experience. You're taking photos, you're keeping drawings, you're keeping notes, and then you're able then to share that knowledge with the people around you. Here's our brother Paul, who has developed the Permaculture Training Center in Homa Bay in Kenya. He was so inspired by his PDC. He went home and sat in his house for a few days and thought, I don't really know how to explain this to my community. I'm just going to have to start my own training center. And he was able to communicate that vision enough to inspire the people around him to allow that to happen. So think about how important that might be as a yield, as an outcome, as an output of the system. Here's a Sarifa Rashida in Bidi Bidi. And look, she's holding up the constitution of PIA, Permaculture Integrated Association. She and a group of other women in Bidi Bidi refugee settlement have come together. They created their own little savings and loan scheme, buying seeds, growing produce, selling it, marketing it together, saving some of that money for next season, and supporting each other, through this team building. using permaculture to identify those objectives and to come together and to build a structure. So building your little local permaculture group is just the same as building your keyhole bed. You're assembling the components of locally available materials strategically to fulfill a longer term function. Soil building, soil accumulation, and then, you know, the next layer of yields. I love this photo because there's a genuine look of pride and accomplishment in her face. And you know, it's represented 6 months into permaculture training and actually having a viable, something that was actually already operating. That's just, you know, so exciting to see that. So yeah, have a think. What are you? Allow this to inform you. This last slide is well, as it says, Mount Elgon Coffee and Honey Cooperative. We'll talk about them later on. But coming together as a guild of people, restoring landscapes, and then creating saleable yields of coffee and honey by restoring the forest in their community. And I think there's something else in that in this obtain a yield is your challenge as a permaculture designer is to find the highest value output of your system and to find the highest value use of your yields. You can grow timber and burn it, or you can grow trees and sell coffee beans. Higher value yield. To think that, yeah, Mount Elgon farmers there they're using permaculture techniques to restore forest to a degraded landscape, and the yields that they're getting from that is coffee and honey, things that have a long shelf life, high value, storable, transportable, exportable even. Yeah. So any thoughts or feedback? You're welcome to share anything.
Hi, Steve. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Gerald.
Yeah, Jared here. You know, the idea of patterns and then using naturally available resources is one of my favorite, you know, topics. It's one of those topics that really drew me or inspired me into permaculture. And even as we go on training, it's one of those topics that naturally manifest. And when now talking as a trainer, and probably for those of for the rest of the team or the members on the training that are looking into training or carrying this on to the next level of training, is one of the topics that if it's well elaborated, Steve does it 1,000% perfectly. If it's well elaborated, it's one of the topics that really captivates people, that really is so diverse and relevant to permaculture. I love the fact that for the training in northern Uganda, for our brothers from South Sudan, people took the idea, ran with it, and they really applied it basing on what is locally available. One Muse used sticks. That's what he had. Bless him, he was one of the oldest participants. Then the other one used a leftover of building blocks. Those are bricks, the ones for building. That's what he had. Probably he was just from freshly constructing his house. And so instead of throwing them away, he used them to construct a keyhole and then start harvesting food from it. Then there was one on a hilly place, which was so rocky, and he accessed the rocks. He went on to utilize those. So same technique and concept underlying, different application, but all together coming, serving the same function at the end of the day. Sorry about my Zoom, it started doing that. Yeah, that's what I could contribute.
Thank you, Gerald. Yes, I'm just
Steve,
yes,
maybe as you work on that, if I could further elaborate or complement
please.
something, the concept of cooperatives, or as we've always, maybe let's also call upon our members or the people on this Zoom to think broadly, to think permaculture in a broader perspective, in rather a more comprehensive view of it, beyond the gardens, beyond the farming, beyond the agriculture. Let's look at it as permanent culture. Culture extends beyond agriculture. It is people's way of living or people's way of life. And living goes beyond the food production aspect. So that's when you're seeing now cooperatives are coming in, energy will come in. So let's look at it more broadly. Let's keep thinking more broadly.
Thank you, Gerald. Yeah, absolutely, because all of these ideas abstract out, so we can think about how it affects to culture and society. That these ideas around looking at ecosystems and nature as our teacher is actually giving us a deeper and wider insight than perhaps we first realize. Let's is that right? Can you see?
Yes, it is.
Yeah,
You go
okay.
culture.
Yes, this is coming
Go
out.
culture.
Hugel culture. A little bit roundabout, I guess. So, obtaining yields. We're still on this same train of thinking. Here's another example. This is something. This is a community garden in Wales, and when we first got there, this was the beginning of a project, and we moved into a site. It was quite tired and derelict. There was all sorts of random materials lying around, and we wondered what to do with them. And some of what we had was rotting wood. It wasn't any good for firewood. It was wet and rotting and been lying around for a while. And we thought we'd try seeing if we could create a multi-functioning food growing system out of the resources that would just happen to be at this location. This is Wales. We have a lot of sheep. Sheep produce wool, which is shorn from them once a year. Wool is very rich in nitrogen, and when they process wool, they sort of take out all the nasty bits and the sort of tangled bits and the dirty bits, and that can represent a really good resource. So What we actually have is rotting wood, which is made out of carbon, and we have rotting sheep's wool, which is made out of nitrogen. These are the building blocks of ecosystems. I wanted to make a raised bed type thing, just like on the same rules as what we discussed for the keyhole bed. So as you can see here, I've dug down through the A horizon soil, and it's turf, this was grass, and then I've piled that upside down to encourage it to die off, on top of the rotten wood and the rotting sheep's wool. So we're using locally available materials, and we're strategically placing them so that they catch and store energy. There were other things lying around on the site. There was lots of dead grass. We also had made a lot of compost. So now you can see how it's called Hügel, means mound in German. This was a Sepp Holzer creation, that Austrian farm I mentioned. And it's like a raised bed. It means that you can grow plants. You don't have to bend over. You've put all of the good stuff, all of the A horizon soil and lots of organic matter together. So that's going to think about how, and also it's arranged on contour. So when it rains, the water is going to sit in this trench. Look, I filled the trench full of wood chip. Here you can see, again, that's an available resource in that place. Everything I used was, I thought about how it would be part of and contribute to the whole system. I found things that either were free or actually were things otherwise we might have wanted to throw away, and built up layers. And then we made the decision, again, it was an available resource. We used horticultural fabric. It's woven polypropylene. So actually, that's the same stuff they make maize sacks out of. That we saw in one of those other examples. We bought this, we paid money for it. The only thing that it does is it's woven, so it's porous to water, but it excludes the light. So all that grass and weeds and things that we'd put in the beds, it's all going to die off. And then once we've grown it for a year, we can then remove the fabric. So, and here we are putting in some pumpkins, some squashes and courgettes. And this is the only intervention. It was the only thing. We planted the plants in a little plug of compost and we watered them in so that the roots were going down. That was it. We didn't touch it again for the rest of the summer. It was completely left to its own devices. And I did this little sequence of the plants getting going over the next few weeks, and it just became a carpet, and the whole lot just disappeared. This was like it was a lot of work building the bed, but once we'd done it, we didn't have to come back and touch it again, and really healthy looking plants, and an abundance of squashes and gourds and marrows and pumpkins, all that same family of plants. They seem to particularly like the fact that the beds trapped a lot of moisture. There was a lot of nutrient availability. Things were breaking down quite quickly, and there you go. Just thinking again, just that simple permaculture idea: observing, interacting, thinking about what we have available, arranging them strategically within mind a particular yield or set of yields that we want to get from. We want to catch water, we want to build soil, and hey, we want to grow a lot of food. There we go. That's a short one.
Steve,
Please.
it hasn't been moving.
Oh.
Yeah, I tried sending you a message.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
It's
been basically on the
Oh
culture.
gosh. Okay. Yeah, I know what I've done. Okay. Yeah. I've confused myself. Thank you, Gerald. Sorry about that. I will go back and we'll a new share. Here it is. Okay, got it. Okay, can you see that? Is that moving now, Gerald?
Yes, it is moving now.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. There's the rotten wood. We built a series of 3 of them. And the reason that it's shaped like that was it's following the contour. We wanted to make sure the water, any rainwater that was trapped behind it, sat there and was essentially would soak into that wood. You can imagine how that rotting wood would hold and slowly release moisture. There's the old sheep fleeces. And there's the trench. You see, there's the A horizon soil, and how we're doubling the depth of it. We're not going to grow on the path. We're going to stand on that. That'll become compacted, so we can reuse that soil by using it to build up the bed. And then, I filled. You can see I filled the trench here with wood chip. So again, that would hold a lot of water, slowly break down, release carbon into the soil, and help feed the system. So this strategic placement of elements to catch and store energy, to set in motion a system that traps water, builds fertile soil, and creates lots of surface area for growing. Look how easy it is to grow on a mound. And once a plant has got its roots, so we could have a very heavy rainfall, and that area might fill up with water, but the plants are still going to be above it, and they'll still be healthy and protected. But if it's quite dry, the roots can go down deep, and they can access the moisture that's going to be wicked up and held inside the bed. So I don't know how these ideas might translate into the tropics, but it's the guy who developed this did it on the top of a mountain in Austria. So who knows? These ideas translate, and it's a nice, simple but effective example of using permaculture design to create a series of yields. A beautiful garden, something to learn from, something that's building soil, something that's feeding nature, and then ultimately something that's feeding us. And thinking about yields, thinking about patterns, thinking about learning from nature. And also in the background of our minds, we're thinking about climate and climate zones, and how we might adjust these ideas, these concepts, these patterns to fit where we are, the resources we have, and what our own objectives might be. So that's going to constantly change. That's going to constantly change. So this is what we think about. So this is a forest garden system in Portugal, in the mountains in Portugal. So it's hot. It gets hot. It gets dry. They get seasonal good rainfall seasonally, but there's a real fire damage risk. And what this particular permaculture approach was to go into an existing forest and sort of thin it out, open up clearings, let in a bit more light, and then establish more diversity, sort of an ongoing process. So I thought that was interesting. I hadn't seen something quite like that before. And here we are looking at the landscape. We're seeing quite young, fast growing, younger, more juvenile trees there. This was our guide who showed us around. And this is like arriving. I think the landscape was sort of terraced. It's going downhill, and it's a mixture of like a semi-wild landscape that they're slowly managing and adding diversity to. And it made me think about the patterning within forests, and especially young forests. I think the forest garden idea really fits well into where we're moving from pasture through shrubs into sort of young trees. So there's still a certain amount of light, again, depending on our climate zone, depending on our humidity, to open up gardens. Here's a natural sort of a clearing in a woodland. Maybe this is kept clear by grazing animals. Maybe groups of deer might come through here or something like that. And seeing how, there's parts of this woodland look quite shaded, and there's quite parts where there's sunlight coming down onto the floor. So we've got more, grasses and herbaceous plants. We've got that lovely, that mix, that diversity that we saw in our diagram. Again, thinking about shrubs, multi-stemmed, woody plants. We've got understory trees, young, smaller trees, taller trees. Think how those fit together. There's a layering effect in a woodland. Look how we've got grasses, we've got herbaceous plants, we've got shrubs, we've got lower trees, we've got taller trees fitting together. There's a different kind of look like brambles, another kind of herbaceous plant entering inside. So there's a pattern. There's a pattern of a young, evolving woodland. And let's also think, that system might include herds of animals might come through there, whether they're domestic or whether they're wild. But those animals, everything gardens, would maintain pathways, maintain clearings by their grazing habits and their movements and manuring and so forth. Look in this young dynamic forest system with grasses, herbaceous plants, shrubs, small trees, big trees. Think how much biomass there is. Think how three-dimensional that shape is, and there's a potential for yields at every level. Let's think about the elements of a forest, how they fit together, and what those yields might be. This is how we want to begin to think as permaculture designers. We're trying to understand more complex systems. Nature's complicated, but we're doing it by seeing the patterns. Oh, look, there's a herbaceous layer, there's a shrub layer, there's a young tree layer, there's an established tree layer, there's climbers, there's things that live in the root, in the rhizosphere, there's fungi and mushrooms and root yields. So there's a three-dimensional set of potentials to be explored in the food forest, and we can have short-term, medium, and long-term yields, maybe very extra long-term yields with long-term, say, timber crops or something like that. Fruits, think of how we could layer fruits into our system, how usually fruiting trees need sunlight to form fruiting buds. So let's think about using them on edges, in clearings, on pathways, on swale lines. How do we stack yields into a system? How do we stack yields into a system in a way in which they perform multiple functions? They create shade, they create wildlife corridors, they feed domestic and wild animals, they feed people, they build soil, they create shelter, they create windbreak, they modify and soften the environment. They help contribute to the leaf litter. Multi-functionality. Bamboo. One of the fastest, or potentially the fastest growing biomass crop in the world. Bamboo is a very important source of food, fiber, building material, firewood, a fast-growing, multiple yielding element that performs multiple functions. And the yields of that can be utilized in lots of different ways. You can use bamboo to build your raised beds. So think about growing the materials that you're going to use to extend your system. You could be introducing bamboo onto the edge of your system and then harvesting and then utilizing that to put in your annual system or your raised bed system, or to create drainage features or reduce anti-erosion features. As we build soil and as we build and the relationships between the plants and fungi develop, Then there's another layer of yields that come from the soil, from the root zone, from the rhizosphere. This is a penny bun mushroom. Now, when I lived in Zimbabwe, in the mountains in Zimbabwe, there'd been a tree reforestation and tree planting programs for timber and commercial uses. And unplanned, but what had happened was when they'd transplanted varieties of trees, I think some of which came from Europe, the mycorrhizal fungi associated with those trees, they came as well. And an unexpected yield from these forestied areas in Chimanimani district in Zimbabwe was these penny bun mushrooms, Boletus edulis. You can dry them. They're very high value. Italians and French people really love this kind of stuff, and they're an important ingredient in many different recipes. Pasta al fungi contains dried, grated Boletus edulis mushroom. So multiple yields coming from the different layers of the forest system. These are the potentials that we're interested in. Can we use our forest systems to be windbreaks and barriers and edges to our annual systems? Think about the multifunctionality of that too. This is just to remind us of that mycelium. This mushroom, of course, is just a fruiting body that's distributing spores, seeding new future generations of mushroom, another yield of the system. But it's also that mycelial net is fusing together the roots from different plants and trees. It's also channeling fungi move nutrients from high density to low density places. They move water from high density to low density places. They have a homeostatic function in forested systems. They help maintain the sort of peaks and troughs and balance things out. So multiple yields from elements in a system, that the fungi are actually making the whole system stronger, but they're also giving you a high value yield. These fungi are really good for your immune system. They're packed full of vitamin D, which certainly in the west and northern latitudes we have a deficiency of in the winter. So what's also interesting is to think, and these come in the autumn, so it's interesting to think of the seasonality of the food that you need to get through the winter comes just before the winter. If you can catch and store it, learn what it is, observe and interact, catch and store, dry it, preserve it, bring it into your let's say yield, and bring it into your own way that you look after yourself. Our ancestors knew and understood a lot about the fungi world. They used them as medicines, they used them to start fires, they used them to make fabrics, and they used them for food. So while we're talking about this and talking about this relationship between plants and fungi, I always like to get this picture in at some point, and it's of a pine seedling. And what we're seeing is the pine seedling is the roots of which are the sort of yellowy, orangey brown. And you can see that they're quite a simple structure with not a massive surface area. But at every point where the root is, there's these white dots. And those are fungal mycelium. They're the these are the mycorrhizal fungi, and which are fusing with the plant, with the hairs of the root of the plant, actually permeating into the root, penetrating into the root, and channeling sugars one way, and then actually being digested by the plant and contributing minerals to the plant in the other direction. And look at how this is microscopic. It's thread-like, single-cell thick hyphae, and look at how complex the interrelationships between the plant and the fungi is. think how much more surface area there is. Think how much more that fungi now is holding onto the soil and preventing it from eroding. The mycelium creates little pockets that hold the soil, hold it all together. Most plants will form associations with mycorrhizal fungi, but the soil needs to not be disturbed and not be compacted to allow these associations to form over time. So observations help us understand how to develop long-term yields by working with the natural processes that are going on. These want to happen. So all we have to do is create the right conditions. We don't need to understand everything in great detail. We don't need to have a name for everything, but we need to understand that if we create the right conditions, which is moisture, oxygen, and decomposing matter, then these associations will start to form and our plants will become healthier, and they will be able to access nutrients and water from much deeper down, from much further. And I think we're moving into times where we're getting these more extreme weathers, landscapes drying out. These are techniques that we need to use and understand to rehumidify whole landscapes. Whether we're thinking in a really small scale or a really big scale, all of these techniques are important. I think I got into thinking about, so there's a leaf on a tree. The tree's still growing, but it has black spots on it. Those spots are a kind of fungi, and it's digesting the leaf. And what happens in temperate climates, in our cold climates here, is the trees don't try, a lot of the trees don't try and carry on growing during the winter. And also, if there was a heavy snowfall, that would break the branches. So what they do is they reabsorb the nutrients back into the tree, deep into the trunk, into the roots, and allow the leaves to fall. And so we get a leaf fall in the autumn, and then suddenly everything's bare. So this fungi, it looks like it's killing the leaf, but the leaf's going to die anyway. This is accelerating the decomposition of the leaf. So when it falls and touches the floor, it's ready to rejoin the soil litter, the leaf litter in the soil. It's almost like pre-digested before it hits that forest floor. So fungi in living systems perform different functions. This is a symbiotic fungi that's helping the plant feed, and this is a saprophytic fungi that's digesting the dead matter of the plant and returning it to the soil. Think about the role of ants and termites in forest systems. Think how good they are, how effective they are at shredding and digesting organic matter. They're constantly returning carbon to the soil. They're opening up tunnels and pathways in the soil, increasing its porosity, air channels, water channels, humidity. They're part of the homeostasis. They're also feeding lots of other elements in the system. Everything likes to eat ants. And they're really nutritious. They're very tough, resilient things, and they're contributing to your ecosystem in ways in which you can't imagine. So when we're thinking about our forest systems and we're valuing every element, we're understanding that that is all part of the yield, and that all of these component parts contribute to a greater whole. And forest systems contain mammals, big mammals and small mammals. They can be very important mobile elements. They contribute to dispersal of seeds, maintaining pathways, regulating other plants and animals, invasive species. It's all part of the homeostasis of the forest system. So this is a northern latitude, so we're seeing a moose or a caribou. What mammals would you see in your system? Think of the function that creature might perform, rather specifically than what its name is. Doesn't matter that much. What matters is it a herbivore? Is it, how does it interact with the system? In what way is it contributing to the system? I put this little vole in to remind me that someone once said that I think some of the biggest trees in the world are the giant redwoods or the giant sequoias. Is that the right word? And apparently, these are the biggest trees. They live for 1,000 years, for longer. They grow hundreds of feet high. The seeds don't germinate unless they've passed through the digestive tract of this vole. The acidity in its stomach and striation and stressing of the seeds passing through it is what triggers the germination. This tree doesn't want its seeds to germinate all at once. It wants them to lie dormant in the ground, maybe for years, maybe for decades, and then they're triggered, reactivated when this little blighter finds it and eats it, triggering that germination. All part of the yield. This is about the relationships between nitrogen fixing acacia tree helping build soil, that also is habitat to a termite which is living in these galls, accessing sugar. The grub of that termite is accessing sugar from the tree, and the tree responds by creating this gall, which is a home to the termite, and the termite in return defends the tree from grazing. So it turns out this acacia is the favorite food of the giraffe. Giraffe have got this amazing, almost prehensile tongue that can strip the leaves off the branch. So as soon as the giraffe starts grazing on the tree, the termites come out and squirt their formic acid, and the giraffe moves on. So the tree's prepared to give up some of its sugar to the soil microbes, to give up some of its sugar to the termites, and then to give up some of its leaves to the giraffe, but only so much. So there's that self-regulating factor in that as well, because we don't want the giraffe to eat the whole tree. It can have some, and it can carry the seeds many miles and deposit them somewhere else, but it can't eat the whole tree and destroy it. So we're super interested in how things interact with each other in permaculture. And imagine, so in a design system or a farm system or in a human system, let's think about these little niches that facilitate these interactions. They're actually all part of the self-regulating homeostatic function of the system. Look at these mighty thorns. It's always a clue. If a tree or a plant is really aggressive, defending itself with thorns or stings, chances are it's very nutritious. It needs to defend itself, otherwise giraffe's going to have the whole lot. So it's not just got the thorns, it's got the termites too. Supporting key functions with multiple elements. That's what nature does. That's how you build strength and resilience. You choose elements that perform multiple functions, and you support important functions with multiple elements. That's how we build strength through design. So, yeah, these are. How are we for time? Do we need a little break? Let me just jump out for a second before I get into autopilot mode. Yeah, so we're at 6 o'clock. We've had an hour and a half. Shall we just take a few minute break, Gerald? Do you think?
Yeah, sure. Let's take 10 minutes
Okay.
and be back at actually let's make it 12 so that we are back at 15 minutes past.
Okay, 15 minutes past.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. See you all back soon.
I've got my tea. I'm all right. Start again in a couple of minutes. Yeah, welcome January. Great to have you here. And everyone, of course.
Yeah, we are listening to you, sir.
Okay. It feels like we've meandered through a few topics today, but there's a common theme. We're thinking about yields, but I'm always pushing you to think about patterns. And we're thinking a little bit about climate patterns. We thought about root patterns. We thought about the shape of the layers in a woodland, in a forest. We've also thought about elements and how those elements fit together in systems to make guilds or ecosystems. Thought about the relationships between things, and we thought about functions. So these are all tools, observational tools, that help us decode and understand nature. We're building a relationship with nature. It's about partnerships. So I've got on my slide is Charles Darwin. That beautiful bronze of him is in Shrewsbury, which is the town that he lived in, and just down the road from us here. So, and Charles Darwin was a great observer, and he kind of decoded evolution. And what's really amazing is he didn't have a telescope. He didn't have a microscope, rather. He made predictions 200 years ago that when we have the technology to look in rocks of a certain age, we would see certain microbes. And he was right. And so we're reminded that the power of observation and what we can decode by looking at nature. And we now have much more insight, shared knowledge. We have tools. We have the internet. We can really break beneath the surface now, and we begin to understand it in a really real way. How we can partner with nature, how we can use natural processes to regenerate, to build soils, to trap and hold more moisture. Simple techniques stacked together to become incredibly powerful. The originators of permaculture, the authors of Permaculture 1, Bill and David. Bill Mollison and David Holmgren. There they are. Bill Mollison passed away in 2016. I think he was like 89 or something. He'd had a full life. He'd made a full contribution. He still had a lot to say. David Holmgren's still with us. And he's the more thoughtful, deep thinking one in some ways. And it's David who's given us these 12 principles, which we're also kind of following our way through. So the obtain a yield. You can't work on an empty stomach. Principle 3, that's David's thinking. Bill's all about the patterns. Who's your local permaculture hero? Who's your guru? Who turned the light on for you or gave you insight? I'm showing you people from the West. This is Arthur Hollins. Arthur Hollins has a worm on his hands and his fingers, and he's saying it's all about the worms. And Charles Darwin would agree with him. Charles Darwin's final book was all about the earthworm, and he identified the earthworm as being perhaps the single most important species on the planet, because it's a soil builder, it's a habitat creator, it's an ecosystems engineer. worms build ecosystems. And if you listen carefully, you can hear Arthur saying, it's all about the worms, it's all about the worms. So thinking about how we develop long-term yields sustainably is by understanding and partnering with the natural systems, those natural processes. It doesn't cost anything. If you create the right conditions, the worms will come. They'll be there and they'll start doing their job, opening up the soil, cycling the nutrients. That's why we use these raised bed techniques. That's why we try and focus our energy deliberately. There's the path, there's the cultivated area, so that our friends in the soil can do their job, can do their work. Arthur, Bill and David, Charles Darwin, these guys are keen observers of nature and asking all the time fundamental questions. Why is that like that? Why is that? What's going on there? What's the relationship? Trying to understand. So here we're looking at the fork in a tree. This is in a humid tropics. This is in the similar climate zone to Uganda. We're seeing a termite mound in the fork of a tree. This time not in galls in the roots, in the twigs and in the buds. Instead, you can see little clay lines. Can you see these brown lines going up and underneath each branch of the tree? Look how they divide there into two. There's all these different roots coming from the termite nest. You may have seen this, but if you break open that clay tunnel, you see it's like a little tube, and inside running, there's the termites, protected from predatory birds or from drying out in the sun. I don't know. That those termites regard the tree as their habitat. And in a similar way to the other example, and it just, again, it struck me that it's only us humans that see the separateness. Oh, there's a tree and there's the termite. In fact, this is an intimate, mutually beneficial relationship. The tree and the termite are folded together, and this idea of symbiosis, complex, mutually beneficial relationships that might have built and evolved over a long period of time. These are things we want to understand. That's Nicholas, right? Yeah, and work with. We're trying to create through design mutually beneficial relationships. Bill Mollison says in his Principles of Permaculture to think about relative location. Components placed in a system are viewed relatively, not in isolation. We're interested in functional relationships between components. So how does a hedge also function as a windbreak? What's the relationship between the tree and the termite? We're told everything is connected to everything else. So we need to recognize functional relationships between elements. We're interested in functions. There's a reason why this is happening or why it's continuing to happen, and it's benefiting both parties. What can we learn from that? There's a principle. So we're interested in succession. These are the mountains of Wales. I've talked to you endlessly. I keep talking about succession and how humble plants give way to more complex plants, and slowly we build a soil and we build a soil biota that can support forest. Well, this is a Welsh landscape, and we're not seeing that. Where's the succession? Up in the mountains here, a place called Cadair Idris. This is a glacial, quite eroded landscape. So just doing a little bit of housekeeping. Make co-host. Gerald, you're co-host. And you can let people in as well. Oops. Hope that's working for everyone. All in the classroom. Okay, so here's exploring these principles, and one of the ones we've been given is succession. And now I'm showing you a picture where I'm not really seeing any succession. And of course, the reason is this is a grazed landscape. This is a landscape including sheep. Sheep can climb mountains, they can go on almost vertical slopes, and they nibble everything down to the ground. So this is about limiting factors. So this landscape wants to be a forest. Why isn't it a forest? It's because it's been continuously grazed. So the succession is not being allowed to happen. How do we know that? Well, let's do an experiment. Let's exclude the sheep from a particular area. Let's here's just a piece of that same landscape that's been fenced off. So the only difference is we've now prevented the sheep, grazing herbivores from accessing this area, and we're seeing different kinds of sedge grasses, heather, bilberry, shrubby fruiting plants, tougher, longer lasting, shrubby plants, tougher, bigger grasses. Look how in the ungrazed section, think about how much more of a sponge there is there. Think how much water that could hold. Think how much more habitat that offers for insects and contribute to food chains of going up to birds and so forth. So an overgrazed landscape can't regenerate. Yes, we're getting a yield. In this system, we're getting a yield of sheep or of the lambs, which gets eaten out each year, but it's at the cost of the landscape. And if the landscape's breaking down over time, then that yield of the sheep is not sustainable. So permaculture, we might have to think, how can we use some patterning? Can we allow the landscape to regenerate to a degree? To create a more diverse short-term, medium and long-term yields, following the natural patterning. This is what nature wants to do, whereas our farming system is turning into a monoculture. Nature wants to diversify. Nature wants to open up niches and allow other species now. So now tree seedlings or seeds drop in here. The birds come to eat the little berries. They bring with them other seeds. There's now something for that tree to germinate in, and we can think how the succession can go forward. Observing nature, thinking about how we can bring these ideas into our designed systems. How can we work with succession? How can we manage grazing animals so that we can have a multiple benefit, but we move away from this monoculture landscape? Think about this is the long-term impact of sheep on the uplands of Wales. It's just reduced think about the long-term impact of too many cattle or too many goats. You have to manage the energy of those grazing animals so that they don't deplete the ecosystem. They're harvesting the yield, they're taking off what is sustainable, but it's not depleting the whole system. I told you this before. You're either building soil up or it's breaking down. It's never just staying the same. It's either moving in one direction or the other. Which direction are you moving in? That's your objective. You're building soil, building water trapment, and feeding yourself, and feeding the wildlife, and feeding the other elements of the system. There's little clues all the time coming from nature. No one's planted what's inside these fence area. It's just been allowed to nature to express itself. And we can watch that, and we can ask ourselves, what's that teaching us? What's that plant? How is it functioning in that environment? So the principle here that's being illustrated is that in time, with the right, left to its own devices, natural systems diversify. They build in complexity. They build in species. They become more stacked in time and space. And as the relationships between the elements, the functional relationships between the elements in the system develop, the system becomes stronger. Look how this system is already reinforcing itself, creating new habitats that might attract new species, that then accelerate nutrient cycles, bring in new genetics, allow that system to grow. Okay, what can that teach you about how you're going to approach your own farming systems? And look, this is what nature does. Left to its own devices, it creates this incredible diversity and abundance of different species and different yields and different elements that contribute to systems in different ways, things that can delight us and entertain us, or remind us of the sheer beauty of nature, the fragility of nature, and also to step back and not just see those individual elements, but understand how they fit together to create a whole system. Look how in this picture of this is actually tropical rainforest has regenerated over decades after being knocked down in a storm. And what we're seeing here is an absolute wonderful diversity of species, huge tall canopy trees. Look at these big tall trees. We've got palm trees underneath. We've got lower understory trees sitting underneath that. And what we're also seeing is every surface is covered in creepers and climbers. So that's other element in a growing system. Think about your passion fruits or your oyster nuts or your grapevines, or those plants are opportunistic and they go off in any direction. They follow the light. They colonize surface areas that aren't otherwise being used. Think about the patterns of that pumpkin plant that I showed you earlier and how that's spread over a landscape. What we're seeing here is a three-dimensional catch and store energy system going up, 30, 40 meters up into the sky. Think how many niches and habitats are within that, in the crook of the tree or on the surface of the leaves or in the deep litter, in the leaf litter, how mammals might move through that system, how birds might move through that system. This is nature's template that we can learn from and understand there's so many different yields within that system that we can be inspired by and learn from. Produce no waste. We'll enlarge on this as a principle. In nature, everything cycles. Nature doesn't do this. This is a landfill site in South London. 40 acres of land being covered in about 40 meters of waste, of refuse from London. We're seeing this more and more and more. This is bad planning. This is, we could design waste out of our systems. Our principle is everything cycles. Our principle is we have to see that waste is an unutilized resource. And if we can create circular systems, this is a compost toilet hole. Toilet waste composted in pine needles from trees, used as a mulch for fruits, that then creates a yield. So kind of trying to make the opposite of this. Can we design systems that become mutually beneficial? If we're using organic processes, then we can always reincorporate those elements back into the system and convert them into a yield. How high value is that? A soft fruit, a peach, as a yield. Now I touched on edges, and I think we got a few. This is something again worth pausing on and elaborating on. And again, all of these themes, everything that I'm saying today, we'll sort of say again. We're trying to elaborate. We're weaving our tapestry out of these ideas. Okay, seeing how they all fit together. So I told you, interesting things happen at edges. We get change edges. We get unique set of circumstances at edges. This is a mangrove swamp, mangrove forest. It's coastal. It's also estuarine. So there's salt water coming in from the sea. There's fresh water coming in from, flowing in from the land. We've got dense vegetation, and we've got open water channels of water. We've got mangrove trees that branch and create surface area and stability in the shifting muds. So they help stabilize that mud. Mangroves are good at flood prevention, protecting coastal erosion. They create an awful lot of edge. They create surface area. And in this water, it's teeming with little shrimps and prawns and crabs and insect pupa and little baby fish fry and bigger predatory fish, coming in around the edges trying to catch the smaller fish. And imagine the nutrient exchange. Imagine the different niches just above the surface of the water, just below the surface of the water. Insects and animals that live on the surface of these trees, on the leaves, and then think how the water changes from salty to fresh. How when the tide comes in and out, the water rises and falls. So we have a set of constantly changing conditions, and all of those edges moving from salty to fresh, from wet to dry, from solid, from firm ground to marshy ground. All the different edges of the plants, those create different microclimates, different habitats, which suit slightly different kinds of plants, slightly different kinds of insects, slightly different kinds of birds, slightly different kinds of fish and other water crustaceans. Within this system, so I was told when I visited this place that it's one of the most biodiverse habitats in the world. There's many different kinds of species living together in some kind, in this ecosystem. And essentially, because it's all edges, there's no one thing. You're never going to get a monoculture in this environment. One big fish is going to take over, or one kind of bird is going to take over, because there's so many different little marginal, opportunities and explorations. So one of the things we said over time is succession tells us that over time, natural systems start off very simple, and then they have the potential to become more and more complex. There might be an apex of complexity, and they might simplify as they mature into long-term woodland. But if those edges are kept open, pathways, flooding, migratory animals, occasional fires, there's different ways in which those edges might be maintained. Obviously, grazing habitats of patterns from animals. Let the light in. Maintain those little differences, and allow that to propagate itself. Edges. Let's think about that. Notice how this building is created a frost shadow. That around the edge of this building, there's a real microclimate. In the northern latitude where we are here, in the winter, the sun is very low in the sky. It doesn't go overhead. It stays very low. So the difference between the sunny side of the building and the shady side of the building is the difference between permanent frost on the ground and it thawing out. So there's a frost shadow in the lee of this building. Microclimate, edges, differences. So different species are going to behave differently according to the opportunities presented. Now, this little series of photos, I took this a few years ago, and I keep coming back to this because it is kind of fascinating. And this is the edge effect. Succession happening from an edge. And what we're looking at is the most unpromising edge, really, that you can imagine. Is we've got a tarmac, it's actually a pavement, pedestrian walkway, tarmac walkway there, pavement, and a concrete wall. And there's actually there's a conduit pipe there, so it's carrying some cables or something. Imagine this. It's a tarmac road. The wind blows. There's going to be little particles of soil and dust are going to blow around in the wind, aren't they? It's going to be eddy around in the current of the air moving. And closer to the ground, closer to the edge of the wall, there's more friction. The air is going to travel less quickly because it's going to be friction caused by surface of the road and the surface, and that's amplified by the presence of this whatever it is, piece of metal pipe. So what happens is the wind deposits those particles that it's carrying. It can't carry as much, so instead of having erosion, we get deposition. And those same forces are happening over time. So it keeps happening. It's not just a singular event. Every time the wind blows, those little particles that happen to be there in the street, the mud off your feet, walking through your shoes, walking past, or whatever, however it's originated there, and it's going to collect at the edge. And I can't stress this enough, so what we're seeing is there's more humidity is being trapped here because we've got soil. As in soil particles, there's also little seeds. Seeds are germinating, and as they grow, they can now hold more water. And even though it's not much, it's not a rainforest, but it's more than what was there before. And it allows them for succession to happen. So look how tiny bit of organic matter and a tiny bit of humidity, and life starts. Succession begins. From random components that were just there in the street. And they're now organizing themselves into a way that builds and grows. So here, look, just a few meters up the street, same street, there's a step here with an overhang. And so what we're seeing is actually a bit more organic matter has trapped. So we've got slightly more developed plants. And as those plants grow, they're also starting to create their own friction, and they're slowing down the movement of other dead matter going past the step. Now, it's very subtle, and it's over a long time, but look how nature's accumulating. It's building on itself. So you as a designer can understand now when I say there's a flow of resources going past you, even if it's on a microscopic level, but it's going past you, it's going downhill, it's moving with the wind, it's moving with the flow. If you can catch and store, slow it down, allow it to hold more water, build some soil, it becomes more complex. It builds on itself. And as it grows and develops, we now get different kinds of plants that start to hold moisture over different kinds of time scales, which then, as we get further up the street, same process is ongoing. We're now getting a real accumulation of materials, and plants are now developing and getting stronger. And unless someone comes along and makes an intervention and tidies that up, eventually the road's going to, will slowly drift over with organic matter. It will build up layers on top of the surface. Nature's doing that anyway. All you're doing as a permaculture designer is observing those things and then speeding that process up and steering it towards the yields that you want. You're using these processes to create yields that you need. This is just nature building on itself. Look how it's building an ecosystem. It's just a damp corner where two walls have come together, and we've got the beginnings of a microscopic rainforest happening there. You look at just where there's little cracks in the pavement, that's where the water flows. That's where the growth has followed it. You can predict where water is going to go by observing the landscape. You could accelerate these processes by making strategic interventions. Okay, we're looking at the corner, a damp corner of a building, but imagine if that was 100 square miles, we were looking down from above, we'd be seeing the same processes. So it's very interesting is realizing that the same things are happening at different scales. These are pioneer species of birds, the kinds of birds that turn up where there's bare ground. This is a quarry, there's been works there, it's filled up with water. There's seagulls and herons and crows and Canada geese. And then coming into that environment, those birds are pioneering birds, and they're bringing with them the eggs, the seeds, and the species that they interact with, seeding that environment with their own nutrients, their own bird droppings, and then kick-starting an ecosystem that ultimately begins to feed them. It's very, very interesting to think how these processes work and how we can learn from them, emulate them, and set them in motion ourselves. So nature abhors a vacuum. This vacuum's been created by digging, artificial exploration, and then certain pioneer species have come into that, and they're going to begin fixing it. They're beginning to bring in the species of plants that we're going to need to repair that landscape. Yeah. Edges. There's an edge. What I'm saying, I think succession comes from edges. Edges creates unique conditions, and ultimately those conditions can stack up and create some of the most productive, diverse, and dynamic ecosystems on the planet. But we're around this exploration of edges. So let's think that again, as you get more temperate, so let's talk about the difference in climate. The closer you are to the equator, the more the sun goes directly overhead. As we move either to the north or to the south, then the sun seasonally becomes much lower in the sky. So limiting factors as you go further north is that we might want to stack our forest system so that the taller elements at the back and the smaller and perhaps more productive elements are in the front, so that they're not shading each other out. Strategic placement of elements to reinforce functions. Our food forest is there to catch and store energy. And if we orientate the plants in the right way, we understand the shape of those plants and how long they're going to grow for. And so we can arrange those elements strategically to fulfill that function, catch and store energy, and have a diversity of yields. So going back to this understanding of what understory plants, surface cover plants, shrubs, trees, long-term timber crops, how we might bring those together. This is a building exploring exactly that same idea, the edge effect. Can we harvest solar energy that then performs multiple functions within the building? Climatically controlling the building, holding rainwater and making that rainwater do a long journey down so that we can reduce flood surges. We can rehumidify the atmosphere. We can have edible yields, medicinal yields, wildlife yields, all within a building that maybe is just an office block or a hotel and forms another function. Strategic placement of elements, combining elements together in stacked three-dimensional systems that then fulfill a wide variety of different functions. This is how we think in permaculture design. These are the lessons we get from looking at the forest, looking at the mangrove swamps, seeing how, understanding those spatial relationships. So, summary of the ideas. I put this slide in because we kind of touched on a few things. Let's just have a summary. We want to choose elements that perform multiple functions. Principles of natural systems. This is what we're learning when we look at natural systems. We see that, each element in a system performs multiple functions. Essential functions are always supported by multiple elements. That's what makes a system resilient. Keep coming back to that. Remember those two ideas. If it doesn't quite make sense, just work through it and slowly allow it to sink into your mind and think about what we mean by we want to choose elements that perform multiple functions. And we want to be aware of what the functions are that we're trying to achieve and to support those with multiple elements. So, function of our food forest is growing food for us. Support that with multiple elements. Let's have some herbaceous plants. Let's have some shrubby plants. Let's have some trees. Let's have some vines. Let's have some that are going to come in different seasons. Let's have a long yield time. All of those then are elements that we're selecting to support the function of food production. We're very interested in diversity. We understand that by creating edges, creating different microclimates and microhabitats, we will have a diversity of species. And that interaction between that diversity of species is what supports homeostasis, keeping things the same, regulating the system. Forests regulate themselves. If there's too many of one insect, then some other species will, exploit that resource and return the balance. Natural systems are stacked. They're three-dimensional. They're not just one or two-dimensional, but also they're stacked in space and time. That there are yields that come at different times of the day, different seasons. There's a sequence of events. How can we bring that into our understanding of our own design systems? Natural systems are typified by symbiotic relationships, these mutually beneficial relationships. As designers, can we try and weave those relationships into our designs? Can we make that our strategy? Nature doesn't like bare soil. Nature, what we see is succession. We see pioneering plants will come in wherever there's a gap and quickly fill it, and then maybe set in motion a chain of events that leads to something else. Succession. We talked about edges and cycling. Nature cycles. And we're very interested in working with local and natural resources. A forest is made out of the natural resources that are there. We can grow on site the materials that we need. We can build soil by trapping and slowing the movement of water and organic matter. We can bring things together strategically to build systems, even if we're starting with almost nothing. And I'm trying to use these terms more and more so we become comfortable with them. We're going to be talking a lot about functions, systems, elements. Within our principles, we talk about ethics. We talk about observation, design, zones and sectors. And we're going to talk about nature as an opportunity. So change as an opportunity. So these are some of our core ideas. And here's an illustration which gets banded around Bill Mollison's permaculture principles. So let's just check that everyone has a slightly different way of describing it, slight variation of terminology, but the ideas that we're describing are the same. So, and you're welcome to find your way of memorizing this, your own way of sharing these ideas and making them your own, because that's what's important. I don't want you to memorize what I've told you. What I want you to do is to understand this for yourself. Our design principles are informed by this strategic placement of elements, relative location, multiple functions, multiple elements, energy efficient planning, the use of biological resources, energy cycling, small scale intensive. There's your keyhole bed. You start small and then you replicate it. Accelerating succession is what we're trying to do. Succession is happening anyway, all around us, but we can make interventions to speed that up. We value diversity. We have an awareness of edges, and we're using our attitudinal principles, our ethics, our design, our accepting of feedback. All of this feeds into our permaculture mindset, our permaculture way of thinking. and this is our our journey. And look, I just like that, the way that's called a desire line, where the council's put a fence, but the kids are going to school have bent a hole so that they can take the shortcut. And there's something illustrates a point for that. So that made me chuckle at the time. Okay, stop sharing for a moment. We still got about 35 minutes, so we can get into another slideshow, but I'm also open to any questions, feedback. Oh, great. Okay, yeah. I can see you sharing the links. I'll get rid of the chat now. Gerald, anything you want to chip in with, or anything that struck your...
No, really. Maybe the last bits of as we go into the design process, well, just as Caroline said, it's a lot of learning, it's a lot of ideas. So when I say not really, it doesn't mean that I haven't, grasped a lot, but it's lots and lots of things to learn. And so, but it's amazing how nature always finds its way back. And as we said, we're going to keep talking in terms of us learning from nature. How do we learn from nature? Nature is calling us to be more resilient, because by nature is re-establishing itself, that's resilience, that's regeneration. It's also training us to do the same. Let's start thinking in terms of solutions. Let's not, someone was saying, let's not glorify or gratify problems. Let's instead glorify solutions. Let's think of a solution for each and everything that comes up. It may not be as easy, it may sound somehow simplistic, but it may not be as easy, but with proper observation, proper thinking, and probably putting the rightful atmosphere inside, or creating the rightful atmosphere, we always come up with sustainable solutions. I will emphasize the word sustainable in this case. Let's now start thinking about long-term, not the quick fix. Then also the interesting bit is when I think this is now the next phase that we'll be going through, though Steve has somehow glimpsed into it. When you're designing, or when you're thinking of any setting that you're putting up, let it be to serve a specific function. You're not setting it up as you wish. Yes, your passion could be involved in there, but does it really meet the function? Does it serve its purpose? Otherwise, you're going to have that case of what Steve showed us. You've designed very good roads and everything, pathways, but then you've made it so hard for the users. So as you designed, or as you worked around your design and everything, you didn't have the users in place. You didn't have the users in mind. And what will happen? They will find a way of, cheating your design, or eroding your design. Yeah, back to you, Steve.
That's great. Thank you, Gerald. Good thoughts. And I always enjoy having your perspective. I'm going to take you to Morocco now, to the high Atlas Mountains. I'm going to think about the climate pattern that they might have there. This is a place called Imlil, and it's in the high Atlas in Morocco. So it's sort of actually sandwiched between sort of Marrakesh, and then the Sahara Desert starts on the other side of these mountains. So it's very arid, but in the mountains they get a lot of seasonal snow and rainfall, but it's very seasonal. And so they have designed and built systems over, I don't know how long, hundreds of years, I think, that catch and store energy and convert it into yields. And as you can see already from this first slide, so I took these slides in March, and what you're looking at is lots and lots of trees. Nearly all fruit trees in the lower slopes, and they haven't got leaves on because it's just before they come into season. And where you're seeing on certain terraces at certain altitude, you're seeing white blossom, and those are plum family plants. So like plums and apricots, and there's a lot of things going on in this picture. Let's talk about microclimate. Let's understand that the conditions on each one of these terraces is ever so slightly different. As we go higher up the mountain, that's the equivalent of going further north in latitude. As we come lower down, it becomes more like being closer to the equator. And if we look across this landscape, we can look how over a long period of time these individual little terraced beds have been built up, and we begin to think about the planning and the design decisions that went into making that. Let's think about how those farmers, perhaps over many generations, have passed that knowledge on and understood what their grandparents did and how to pass that knowledge on so their grandchildren understand how to maintain the system. Think about multifunctionality, multiple functions, how these raised terraces obviously slow down the passage of water. They stop erosion. They allow the building and accumulation of soil to happen. They can begin to establish little micro growing areas, some of which are for annual plants or fodder plants for their animals, and others are fruits that they're going to catch, they're going to pick, and they're going to send down the mountain to Marrakesh, a big city that's down there on the edge of the desert. And that's going to be their income. And obviously, they're going to sustain themselves as well. I thought it was interesting that the settlement, the houses, which is also the roads and the roofs, and all of that potential water catchment for when it does rain, is above the orchards. They can hold the water that flows off of the town and direct it down the slopes to nourish their orchards and their fruit fields. If we look into the system, we see look at the detail, how beautifully built these terraces are, and how there's layering. They were growing irises along the front of the terraces, and then these are the plum trees coming into blossom around the houses. A very careful awareness and use of space. Enhanced catchment. When I was looking at the terraces, I could see that around each tree they'd excavated like a saucer so that rainwater would trap and be encouraged to infiltrate and nourish the roots of the tree. Catch and store, slow things down. You'll also notice that they'd added into that saucer Looks like compost or organic matter, a mulch, to reduce evaporation, to give the water a chance to soak in and have more time to soak in and nourish the tree. Look how carefully the tree has been pruned. The branches have been modified in shape very carefully so that one tree isn't shading out another tree. So they've got the maximum catch and store energy for each plant, so balancing that out. So look at the relationship between their ability to catch and store energy to create a stable landscape. Look how steep it is. Look how actually it's just, if you go above where you can see they've cultivated, it's just bare rock. There's nothing. They've, by careful observation, by working on contour. So what they would do is they regard the riverbed. So there's seasonal rainfalls, the river will be raging torrent carrying gravels and rocks and boulders and things with it. And then the seasonal rainfall passes through, and then the community members can walk out into the riverbed and they can choose the stones that they want. And they can create pathways that go along the contours. So they build the terraces, not by carrying rocks uphill. You don't want to carry rocks uphill. You carry them along the contours. And that way you're constantly finding a level. They make water flow sideways, which then gives them a sense of a clear sense of the level. And that tells them how to build their terraces. The detail, the strategic placement of elements between the terraces, the individual trees. And then look now how we've got another yield underneath the trees of fodder for animals. I think they're growing ryegrass, which they're feeding to their donkeys, and asses that they're using to manage the landscape. Look how at a certain altitude the plums are coming into blossom, and how you would have, as you go higher up the mountain, each sequence for each tree would come slightly later. So you don't have to pick all your plums on the same day, but you've got a timed, stacked yield. The way they've used this and managed this landscape so adeptly, you start to think, this is like an ideal growing environment. And that they're just, taking the benefit from that. Well, actually, the opposite is true. This is a really challenging environment where they get all their water at once at one time of year, and then it's steep slopes with no soil. The only soil that's there is because they've built it, and they've built it over time, and they've valued every bit of organic matter, and they've slowed it down and tried to prevent it from leaving the system. Look how here so you don't know how big the flood of the river is going to be or exactly the channel it's going to take. So some of these fields that they're establishing along the river edge might get washed away. Some, they're prepared to take that risk. But what they do is they keep trying, they keep pushing, they keep innovating, they keep adding. Like I say, there's no upper limit to productivity. You could always find another niche and stack another element into the system. Look how they're slowly working their way up the hillside. Even going up close to the snow line, there's still orchards, and the creativity, the ability to build more orchards was staggering. So I was fascinated by just say these little edges, these little areas where they could slow water to catch enough down to start building another system. For all this, how harsh and rugged this landscape is, and they've managed to create a garden by placing it in the right place, slowing down the passage of water, allowing soil to accumulate, identifying the right guild of plants that they want that worked for them, that fulfilled the function, grew in that environment. It created a yield they could sell, but also they had other elements in that maybe gave them other crops, whether it was bees or honey, or I noticed they were grazing goats. But it has to fulfill that function of soil building. So again, looking here, you get a sense of how they might go about creating new exploring new potentials is, here's the riverbed. So you take a little side flow, a leat from the river, and you find the contour and you let that water flow. And then periodically you can put some stones in that channel so the water overflows. And you can see there where now we're creating a watering effect, we're starting to get a bit of green, a bit of photosynthesis. This is the beginning of the process of making the next set of terraces. And the terraces will be built out of the rocks that are there already, and then anything that they carry in along the contour using their animals. So again, looking down this vast, almost moonscape valley, where's the settlement? Where are little farms? On the edge. In the same way as we saw on the side of the street and the pavement, we've got the same thing going on here, but at a different scale. So instead of just being a few mosses and what have you growing here, we've got whole food forest systems that are growing on the edge between the steep slopes of the mountains and then obviously the riverbed and the area that's going to flood. So we can't come too far into the riverbed because we're going to get washed away in the seasonal rains, and we can't go too up high the hill because it becomes too steep. So instead, we're exploring the edges, strategic placements of elements, slowing down the through flow of water, mineral particles, and then allowing that to grow, growing fodder plants, catching and storing every energy, cycling everything back through the system, holding on to all the manure, making compost. So here, these are brambles. This is a thorny, rambling plant that they grow across the terraces. It discourages grazing animals from going in there, and they can get it also encourage the baby goats to nibble at the edges and get another yield there. Stacking yields into the system, exploring the edges, seeing how, can we get one more yield in? What can we grow on those stones? What's going to eat what grows on those stones? What can I grow underneath my fruit trees? We could slowly bring more elements, stack more yields into the system. But the rule number one is you slow down water, you build soil, and you strategically place things that they can start a process of accumulation, regeneration. They're following all the rules of succession here, all the things that we've been talking about in theory, and here they are, farmers in the high Atlas of Morocco, and they're doing exactly that. And they're constantly innovating, they're constantly trying out things. They're not always successful. Sometimes things get washed away, sometimes it doesn't quite work, but they keep trying. And look, they're constantly learning. So look how they've stabilized this edge with these irises, and then behind the irises, this looks like maybe a grass crop or a fodder for animal crop. And then this is just a little bit, they've created a drainage channel there, so water's encouraged to flow around this garden, and they've stacked another little yield into the system. And I just get a sense of people no one ever looked like they were busy or in a hurry. They were but you notice there's a few guys a few miles up there, some women down there in the valley, and this is what they were doing. Strategically arranging elements, catch and store energy, build yields, spotting the little microclimates and little habitats and seeing what they could build into it. And the whole thing was powered by, that's a mule, so a cross between a horse and a donkey. They grow the fodder for the animals, they collect their manure and use the manure to build the terraces. Because there aren't any tarred roads up there, so, cars and motorbikes, no good. You're either on foot or you're working with local and natural resources, working with biological resources, which produce outputs, manure, which can be harvested and used to build the system. So if those farmers in the high Atlas can produce a range of different crops, a range of different yields, whilst building soil, whilst increasing the ability of their system to hold water, to build soil, more surface area, better catchment of the sun's energy. You can see how a system like that can build on itself and grow, and perhaps over hundreds of years, how you could transform. The potentials are actually unlimited. And these are simple techniques, but it's about having things in the right place, understanding that you're fulfilling functions, and there's a hierarchy of function. Catch and store energy, obtain yields, build relationships, maintain edges, allow for diversity, allow the system to evolve and grow. Gosh, right, I rattled through that one. So we've got about 15 minutes. I'd love to have any comments, anything from anyone, or just any thoughts or questions, or again, Gerald, anything you'd like to share with us?
I think this time we'll basically welcome questions from the. Oh, Simon has a hand raised. Yeah, Simon, you can go on and unmute.
Yes. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Simon.
Yes, I want to talk on, we are discussing on nature, on how we bring succession back onto our soils. Here is a scenario where one would apply the soils that are built by the termites from the anthill. He applies it onto his gardens, and it helps us in improving on the drainage system of the soil, and then eventually also adds some iodine into it, as well as adding some fertility in the soil. In that process of doing that, it helps us in a long run as compared to these inorganic fertilizers that one would have preferred to use. But again, at the same time, they are too poisonous to ourselves and the macro and micro living organisms that help us in the process of decomposing the organic matter that we sometimes put into our gardens in a way of mulching it, to prevent the evaporation of water from the atmosphere, from the soil to the atmosphere. In other words, we are trying to reduce the process of that evaporation such that the water holding capacities of our soil has to be maintained in order for us to increase on our productivity in yields, in water collection in our soil. So I prefer members to use the little natural resources that they have around themselves, such that we attain and maintain our nature, which is not so toxic to us, rather than on those other inorganic fertilizers and the rest. Nature is nice to use, and nature does not harm anyone. Through nature, productivity itself can be maintained. I think that is what I'd wanted to add on soil improvement and the use of nature and the local resources around us. Ant-hills are good as a source of manure for the soil. They are good for the for improving on our or mostly to improve on our soil drainage system. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. That was really elaborate. And then, like Staten, you just hammered that we call it hammering the nail on the head, Staten. Any other questions or clarifications or additions? Maybe as we wait for anyone else to come on, I'm fond of, translating, permaculture ideas into like real life scenarios. Edges. So other than the edges in the natural environment, we can also translate the same concept into our day-to-day lives. You could realize that during the times which we could call edgy times, or during those times when you're probably between going through lots of, let's say, a bit of challenges, not in the midst of the crisis, but probably the challenges are existing, the crisis has been there, and now you're in between. So that's when you find yourself thinking hardest or coming up with the ideas. Yeah. So at the point where your uncomfort is probably setting off or meeting off with a comfort, that's where now you're going to do lots of thinking. Again, it takes us back. As that happens, now take time, draw back, and think, how did it start? How did it go? What are the lessons learned? And how best can we, improve, or how best can I do it better next time? Or how best can I prepare myself just in case probably the same crisis comes up? So sort of a self-revaluation. You're using now feedback, you're creating sort of a feedback group. As we go on, we will look at valuing, like receiving and valuing feedback. But then still it comes up during the edges. And maybe some of you have been observant. If you're looking, let's say, at the roadsides, between the road and the fields, that's also another kind of edge. And there are some of the places that are, really, really fertile. It's one other practical aspect. If you're by the, I used to do a bit of fish farming and a bit of aquaponics, a little bit, as I was trying it out. But then my favorite spot to do the cultivation would be near the ponds. That's also an edge. You're having two ecosystems, the pond and the land converging. So that's an edge in between. All right, Steve. So if we don't have any questions, I think we'll go back to Steve and probably wind up. And
Okay. Thank you, Gerald, and thank you everyone this week for your attention. And we're carrying on the theme of yields next week as well. And I hope there's a lot of, I think, to really become conversant with these ideas. And there's a lot of, not like repetition, but yeah, like just keep reinforcement and I'm going to, and as we move further into the course, I'm going to show you more and more practical examples and of how different people have made these ideas, relevant, or how we can apply it to very specific functions as well. There's a long way to go. There's a lot to think about, but I hope already you've got some useful tools. You could begin observing, interacting around you, thinking about how you're catching and storing energy, and understand that as you develop your yields, there's no upper limit to what you can do. You can always add another element, whether it's something that helps build the system or it's a yield for you yourself, for you as the farmer or whatever. And then let's also just think about how these ideas abstract. Information is a yield, knowledge is a yield, human connection is a yield, a community is a yield. Let's value that we can almost fold these yields into the processes that we use in establishing our system. Think about how, I'm only guessing, I have no idea, but what the discussion might be amongst those people in the Atlas Mountains of Morocco and how they understand what they're doing. Maybe those people have never heard of permaculture, but they are observing and interacting in exactly the same way. So what we're interested in is the function. Is that we don't care. We don't care what it looks like. What we care is it working, and it's clearly working. So there we can take lessons from other communities in other climate zones, in other sets of conditions, but understand that we can use those same principles that they're understanding and applying, and make them relevant in our own circumstances. Okay, that's my closing thought. I thank everyone for your attention and remind you that everything is being, although I've only recorded on YouTube this time. Anyway, I'm capturing the material, catch and store energy, and filing it so that you can come back and review it. And also, these slideshows are also available on the webpage, and you're welcome to take those and use them for revision and for your own teaching as well. I really believe this information needs to be out there for everyone. Okay.